Good morning and welcome to Reopening Connecticut Arts Venues Science-Based Safety. I'm Eric Dillner, CEO of the Shoreline Arts Alliance and the chair of this task force. The mission of our task force is to offer you the opportunity to reopen your arts venues from a public health perspective, provide a listening and sharing platform, and to help build consumer confidence through science. Last week, we began our site visits throughout New England to meet with leaders from Florence Griswold Museum, Twain House, Flock Theatre, Hill-Stead Museum, Real Artways, and various outdoor venues like the New London Waterfront Stages and Connecticut College Arboretum. Today, we will share common themes and solutions to help you with your decision-making as we look through the lens of public health. For instance, audience and visitor safety includes restroom solutions, signage, and entryways, many of which will be applicable to leaders working in various arts venues, including historic homes, libraries, and teaching studios. We are so grateful for your intention to do everything you can to open with science as your guide and remain open safely. Your input has shaped our webinar series and continues to do so. So please keep sending us your questions, success stories, thoughts, and needs to help you find success. With hundreds of questions coming in each session, we've moved the live webinars all to Zoom so that we may answer even more of your questions. So today, let's use the Q&A in Zoom for asking your questions and reserve the chat for resource sharing, telling us all about your successes, and also those great moments you're finding of clarity. On July 23rd, we will drill down to specifics about your venue operations, answering targeted questions about HVAC and the like. Krista Pollitt will be joined by her colleague, Julie Paquette, who is the Director of Energy Management within the Office of Facilities at Yale. Facilities directors, operations directors, and house managers, please send me your specific goals, challenges, and needs by Wednesday of next week so that we can be better prepared to help find you solutions. We encourage everyone to attend each of our webinars, regardless of your art form, and follow Shoreline Arts Alliance's YouTube channel and Facebook, as we will begin releasing videos of our site visits very soon. The Dean of Public Health and his team are extraordinarily generous with their time, and we ask that you respect their time by sending your questions and needs to the task force members. Their contact information will be shared in the chat. Let's meet with the doctors to help us reopen Connecticut arts venues and keep us safe. I'm pleased to introduce to you once again my co-chair, Sten Fairmoon. Sten is Dean of Yale School of Public Health and holds the Anna M.R. Lauder Chair in Public Health, as well as a secondary appointment in pediatrics in the Yale School of Medicine. As an infectious disease epidemiologist, Sten's research pivoted quickly to focus on COVID-19 emergency. Sten and his wife are deeply fond of Connecticut's cultural arts, and he is pleased to offer his advice and counsel to arts organizations. Today, we also have Sten's colleague, Crystal Pollitt. Crystal is the assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Health Services of the Yale School of Public Health. She also holds an appointment in the School of Engineering and Applied Science. Her research is focused on understanding our exposure to environmental factors and the impact on our health. Thank you both for helping us to look through the lens of public health. Together, we will make a better future for the arts, I'm sure. Let's begin today by discussing some of the common solutions for audience and visitor safety. In our site visits, we discuss some options to set the tone for attendees through registration and reservation. This can apply to most of all of us, whether for the classroom, an event, tour of a historic home, or gallery. Sten, what are some ways we might approach reservations?
Thanks, Eric. I learned a lot from talking to some of the folks who are planning their reopening or already have reopened. For example, there are venues that are going strictly to online reservations. Those tend to be venues that already were heavily relying on online reservations, and they simply pivoted to making it 100%. So if an arts venue has a mature website and ability to sell tickets online, that's just one less step of human-to-human contact that is necessary, and people can come already ticketed. If that's not practical, then having a ticket booth that has some protection, added protection, for example, plexiglass, a sort of plexiglass wall, which doesn't have to be thick. It can be very thin. It can be you can easily talk and hear around it, but that any sort of droplets, aerosols would be essentially blocked by a barrier. That's another great strategy. And a third great strategy is what I learned when I went to FloGriz, and the Florence Griswold Museum has migrated its ticketing to a little barn-like structure just outside the museum. So you actually purchase your ticket in the barn, but it's open air. And we all know that the great outdoors are friendly to us vis-a-vis COVID because of dilutional factors, that the air dilutes any kind of aerosol, and the agitation of the air sort of drifts it away, so that we have a safer environment if we're ticketing people outdoors. Of course, you'd like to have those little spots on the ground to show what 6 feet apart are, and have some enforcement friendly reminders of people who sort of forget to stay on their spot. You can also ask family groups or travel groups to have a single person buy the tickets, not have a big group of 6, 7, 8, 20 people lining up, sort of clustered. So those are just some pragmatic approaches. By the way, another feature is almost legal, and I'm by no means an attorney, but when you buy the ticket, you agree to certain comportment and a certain kind of COVID citizenship, so that you agree that you will continue to use your masks, you will agree to the 6-foot physical distancing, this sort of thing.
Great. Well, thank you, Sten. That's great and helpful. And I love the idea of moving it outside. That was really an exciting idea that FloGriz came with. So we found in our site visits thus far that entryways really set the mood for attendees. They begin the visitor experience. We've all known that for a long time. But today we even are able to have those, I'll say, relieve stresses or anxieties for those folks who are entering for the first time as they venture into our space. So how important is signage and placement of these signs for these folks?
Well, signage is a friendly way to remind people of something. And so there's no downside to a simple sign reminding people that this is one way and that is the other way, reminding them to put their masks back on. There's no downside to signage that is meant to maximize adherence to guidelines. So one can use arrows, one can use one-way entrances, one-way exits. One can alert people to hand sanitizer. I remember seeing a hand sanitizer that was awkwardly placed, but it was very conveniently placed from the museum's point of view, but it was awkward because I missed it. I didn't see it. So I simply suggested don't change the hand sanitizer venue because it's very well anchored where you've got it, but have an arrow so that I look down. And sure enough, that would solve the problem. Keep in mind too that that everybody has to buy food, and so the grocery stores, many of them are using the 6-foot placements, the arrows, the signs, such that many of us in the state of Connecticut are already acclimatized to these issues because we go to the grocery store. So it may not be a big, heavy lift this summer as we open up our museums and venues to ask people to do this, because people are already used to it.
Thank you, Stan. That's very helpful. Judy McElhorn from 5 Points has a follow-up question about gallery entrance.
We have a 3,800 square foot gallery space. We expect to have about 25 people in the space at one time. Is that reasonable?
That is very reasonable. That's very conservative. I'm not as good at mental math as my colleague Crystal Pollitt, because she's an engineer and I'm not. But you know, when you think about sort of potting sort of 6 feet clusters, you can fit a lot of those clusters in 3,800 square feet. And at the end of the day, I've noticed that some venues are being more conservative than Crystal and I have been recommending. So, you know, if you get a little guidance, and we could do a WhatsApp tour of your facility with you and just sort of walk through it with you, and we could think that through more precisely. If you've got somebody who's good at draftsmanship, or somebody who works in architecture or construction, they could walk the museum with you to sort of cluster where are the likely places where people are going to want to stop and look, and based on those likely places, sort of strategically think, well, how many of those places, how many stations, if you will, should we have, and can we manage the flow reasonably through those stations? That can help rationalize the exact number of people you'd like in your museum at any given time.
Excellent. And actually, as we're talking about flow and going through through museums, I think Frank Tavera actually wants us to talk a little bit about not only museums but also theaters and what we should do with flow.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Eric. Sten, I mean, many of our theaters, museums, galleries, you know, patrons arrive early. They some of them may be a little bit older. They're looking for a place to sit down, relax, perhaps to view a piece of artwork or something, or just, you know, be patiently waiting for the performance to open up. Should we be encouraging, discouraging the use of benches, getting people to sit, you know, stationary for any period of time? And how does that impact the rest of the flow of a building?
Well, Frank, you phrased that very sensitively, and I thank you for that, being that I now qualify as one of your elderly clients. At the end of the day, one likes to be courteous to one's clients, and a bench is a form of a courtesy for someone who needs to take a bit of a rest. And one compromise between two extremes. One extreme is remove the bench and you've got to stand and you've got to keep moving. The other compromise is to limit the density of seating at the bench. And having a marker, you may sit here, you may sit here, please don't sit here. And then that functionally enforces a sort of 6-foot distance. Many benches can accommodate 2 people at each end, or 2 clusters of, you know, a mother and the kids at one end and a mother and the kids at the other, that sort of thing. And I think that might be a superior alternative than to ban them. I think honestly, it's going to depend on the specific space and the specific structure of that space. If you have a bench that is going, by its use, is going to facilitate crowding, get rid of it. If you've got a bench, on the other hand, in the middle of a room that can be easily accommodated as long as it's not crowded in and of itself, then one could utilize it. I also think that one can talk about the bench equivalent in a theater, the notion of how to seat people in family clusters and try to maximize the spatial distance between clusters, but also maximize the number of people you can get into your theater. So these are sort of principles that sort of translate across each other.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sten. Becky Bollier from the Florence Griswold Museum would also like to ask you a few questions about that.
Well, I just have a question related to something that came up a little bit earlier about signage and about managing flow. So kind of looking at both of those issues, but particularly in the context of historic sites and historic buildings, when many of us are dealing with lower ceilings, smaller spaces. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about, for all of our historic site colleagues, your suggestions on how we can utilize signage and the ability to host patrons in some of these areas.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks for your hospitality recently. We have many of these historic buildings have been retrofitted for Americans for Disabilities Act, ADA compliance. And that might simply adapt a front door, but more often it adapts a side door. And just as we saw in the Florence Griswold house, you have been exploiting that for entry to the front door and exit through the ADA side door. And I think that may be a model for other historic houses. Now, somebody on the call today is going to say, well, we can't do it in our house. And I get that. And that may have to be where you have limited entry of, say, 5 people, and then they all exit, and then you have 5 more. But you can get a lot more people through a house, and we saw this at Mark Twain House as well. You can get a lot more if you have groups and they're following each other. And then you don't have to wait until the entire tour is finished for a particular subset of clients. You can stagger them. You know, and ultimately, you can also keep in mind that the main floor is far from a first floor. Second floor, you know, they're far apart, and they are in some ways separate physical venues and can be exploited at the same time, I think.
Thank you. Darren Wood from Flock Theater would like to follow up on the tour question and talks.
Sure. I have a question actually about tours and talks. And this is, you know, do we need to eliminate, say, a museum guided tour, or at a performance venue, a backstage tour? Because quite often these tours will take visitors through smaller spaces and, you know, just to view specific items. Just get your feedback on that.
Sure. I'll make a couple of suggestions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Crystal to talk about the small spaces challenges, because she's expert in that topic. Her research has to do with quality of indoor air, and she's looked at toxins and infections and this sort of thing. So we want her to comment on that. Different groups are approaching this differently. Some folks are retaining their docents and simply relying on mask use and physical distancing. That might work in a museum, for example, that has more space, and that one can manage that. You can have 5 visitors and a docent, and everybody can be apart. There are going to be environments in which that's not practical. That we just talked about some of the historic houses, and there are ways of tackling that. For example, if a docent wouldn't mind being a virtual docent, and there could be numbered spots, and the docent could be telephoned or WhatsApped, and from that spot, and the docent could actually walk them through what they're seeing, because the docent can have photographs of precisely what the visitors are seeing, and can walk them through it as if they were there. And that's especially attractive in tight spaces, or when the docent, him or herself, is actually in a vulnerable category. You know, a 70-year-old docent who has some kidney disease, we're not keen for that person to be physically proximate, especially in a tighter space, because that person is at especially high risk of coronavirus complications. A 40-year-old docent might have a different risk calculus. And other ways of doing it is, if you don't care so much about the real time, you can do what's very commonly done in Europe, which is the sort of system where you dial a phone number, and then there's a recorded message about what you're seeing. And some of you may have been contemplating moving to that anyway. Now maybe is your opportunity to do so. But let's turn it over to Crystal to talk about small spaces.
Right, so these small spaces are a really important point to consider. And we've gone through some suggestions as we've spoken about decreasing occupancy within these spaces. Wearing masks is really important for everyone. And then also the other big factor is ventilation. So working with your building engineer, your facilities person to think about what type of ventilation do you have in that space? Do you have open windows, or is there natural ventilation? Is it served by an HVAC with mechanical? What is the airflow that's being delivered to your supply? To think if that's reasonable for the number of occupants that you want to have in there, especially with COVID considerations, reducing that. And then thinking about supply systems, additional systems that can be offered to enhance that ventilation. So this could be with putting an air purifier into the space, or if you have a window, opening that, putting a box fan in, ventilating out, so that you have more airflow.
Excellent. That's so helpful. Thank you so much. Judith, I think you had a question, but it seems like we might have covered most of it. Do you have any follow-up there?
This has been tremendously helpful. As you may know, we have just purchased the former UConn campus. So we're working both inside and outside and trying to make the community aware of the safety procedures we're taking. So Sten, you're saying mostly signage both inside the building, but also signage outside, as much as possible to just to build that consumer confidence, correct?
Right. I'm just gonna say one thing that's probably obvious to everybody. If you overwhelm people with signage, they'll start to tune out. So it has to be strategic. It has to be thought through. I wouldn't have a sign when it wasn't necessary or wasn't useful. On the other hand, most venues are under signaged at the present time. There's no need for it. We're not trying to keep people apart. We're not trying to have one-way client flow. So now that we're doing things a little differently, I think that having signs, some of them will be literally signs, some of them will be markers on the floor like arrows, I think can be helpful. Keep in mind too that we've been very liberal with client flow. So our visitors who come into the museum, if they're lucky enough to realize that the introductory notes are to the left, then they go to the left and they stay left and go around. But they might go right. They might, I always get befuddled, so others might get befuddled as well. So I'm always going one way, then one museum, another way, a museum. I never learned museum, flow, sort of characteristics. So now we're going to Martin will be the Martinet. We'll organize it so that we ask people to go in a particular direction. That's probably going to be really easy to do. One little sign with an arrow pointing left, I'm going to go left. If you have the arrow pointing right, I'm going to go right. This is not rocket science. And if I see arrows on the floor, then they can guide me as well. Now, keep in mind that you can confuse people if the arrows are not crystal clear. Like you've got two arrows going two directions. To you, that means you can go either way. But to a client, it might mean, which way do I go? So, you might have the arrow going one way saying gift shop, and the arrow going the other way is saying, snack bar. And just so people don't stand there befuddled which direction they want to go. So, there's an art to signage, and I think that artists such as yourself will manage it much better than I would.
Thank you so much, Stan. That's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. It was interesting actually in our site visits to see how Stan and I often followed a simple sign, but if there was a lot to read, we were chatting and talking about something else and would miss our guide. So
simple is good.
It was great.
Simple is good.
Simple sign. So restrooms are a concern for everybody in the arts industry, in every industry, I think, how to handle this. We're seeing it as we go to the, out in public, handled so many different ways. I have to say we were so impressed by Florence Griswold's solutions that I thought, Becky, if you don't mind, would you share a little bit about what your solutions are?
Well, I really appreciate that, Eric, and obviously it means a lot, and to have you and Sten come and visit us was overwhelmingly important in terms of confidence building for us. One thing that we did is we have small restrooms and we don't have a large number of them, but we converted them to gender neutral spaces so that they're no longer a women's room and a men's room, but instead they are all gender, and we installed locks on the door, which we have keys to if there's a curious child. But also in order to limit the numbers to individuals or family units that are going into those smaller spaces. One conversation that we had that was an interesting one was about multiple sinks. And thinking about that in terms of, for those of us who are turning those into single-use bathrooms or anticipating a future move to welcoming more people into the restrooms again, should we be closing off some of the sinks? Should we be doing different measures for that? Sten, what do you think about that?
Okay, so when you convert a small restroom that used to accommodate 2 or 3 people into a single use, then you don't care about the sinks because you've only got one person in there anyway, or one family group in there anyway. So let me talk about the more complex circumstance where you've got a somewhat bigger restroom. You really can't afford to have one person at a time. You might have a little sign saying, please, 3 people maximum at a time, or something to control. And I've seen this at schools where I came to visit a school and they were going to put tape over every other sink. And, you know, we have a phrase in public health, perverse consequences of good intentions. And the good intention is physical distancing, but the perverse consequence is less hand washing. And I would never urge us to take sinks out of commission. We want people washing their hands all the time. So what one can do instead is talk to your friendly carpenter and think about a simple plexiglass division between the 2 sinks, such that you can't physically separate the sinks, but you can actually physically separate the people who are using the sinks. And in this way, you keep people safe or safer, and you keep these sinks in use, which is what we want people to be washing hands. So that would be a thought related to trying to avoid taking them out of commission. And I might also mention the men's rooms. If you're not going to go to the single gender room, but you're going to use the men's rooms for men, all of us men have been to the airports or the public spaces, and there have been dividers. And those are more for privacy and splash, dare I say. But now we have a very different reason to want one of those things, which is coronavirus. So if you have urinals that are proximate but don't have that divider, perhaps this is the time to make that investment. It isn't going to break the bank compared to other costs you're all facing. Having a divider between the urinals would be a low cost way, and you'll gain the side benefit of privacy, urine splash, dare I say, and then now you've got a barrier with coronavirus.
And Frank, do you have a follow-up question to that?
Yeah, so let's assume we do get everybody to actually wash their hands while they're in the bathroom. Right? So now, I think everyone was trying to be, environmentally sound, installing hand dryers with blowing air. Now, is a hand dryer a detriment to the process? Are we better off using paper and now leaving soiled materials in a garbage can? Where are we with, clean hands now once they've actually been washed and dried?
Yeah, I'll make a brief statement, and then I'd like Crystal to respond to that because she's expert at that. The brief statement is there are a lot of things right now that are turning back the clock on sustainability issues. In the hospital, in public venues, There are a lot of things in which we're now going to single use. And of course, that just increases the plastic load on planet Earth. It fills up our landfills, it wastes resources. And I'm hoping that this will be a 1-year temporary setback in what we all care about, which is sustainability and reducing waste on planet Earth. But for this year, we are erring on the side of reducing risk based on commonly shared utensils or commonly shared food plates and this sort of thing. So with that sort of introductory comment, let's have Crystal answer your question.
Great. So the comment about use of hand dryers and is that safe? So this all comes back to what you mentioned of are people washing their hands sufficiently? And if we make this assumption, which we hope by now, this is being, the pivotal message that everyone should be washing their hands for 20 seconds using soap. If we make that assumption, after that time, our hands should be clean, and then any spray of water coming off the hands, that should not be of concern. Also, the orientation on the hand dryers is usually away from the person's face, so hopefully that's being going down to the ground. But it's absolutely essential that there's signs reminding people to wash their hands, and in that way we can still use hand dryers.
Excellent,
Thanks.
thanks.
And that's the challenge right there.
And that's a challenge, right? Let's stay in the restroom for just a few more minutes and talk about changing stations. What do we need to do to accommodate folks who are using the baby changing stations?
Right. As a pediatrician in my first life, I was a big fan of those. I thought it was a tremendous courtesy to parents to make it easy to change diapers in a public space. When you do sort of space-time analysis, they're not used very often. A lot of parents are pretty good at changing the baby wherever they are, and they're not necessarily using those stations. And I'm going to suspect that a lot of parents who might have used it in the coronavirus era are going to forego them. So I don't think this is going to be a big ticket item. But what would be ideal is having the ability for a parent to wipe off the changing station after use, and they might want to wipe it off before use. Now, this, of course, takes volunteerism and takes adherence to recommendations, and it would require a sign. So you would have to say, please wipe down the changing station after use, even if it does not look soiled. Something like that, because some people say, well, it looks clean to me, I'm not going to wipe it down, and they're missing the point. You can't see the virus. So at the point where you have universal wipe down after use, it should be fine. It was pointed out to me on one visit that you can't be sure of that. You can't be sure that somebody is actually going to do it. So maybe we should have a sign saying, please inform the museum staff if you've used the changing station, and then the museum staff goes in and wipes it off. But both of them require the cooperation of the individual. If they're not going to wipe it down, are they really going to go tell the museum staff? Now, since they're not used very often, it would not be unreasonable, let's say in a 10-hour day when the bathroom is available, to have a schedule where every 2.5 hours, 4 times, you had a museum staff member who actually wiped it down. That would be like your insurance policy. So you would ask people to wipe it down, but then periodically you would have it wiped down. So those are just some thoughts.
Those are great thoughts. Thank you so much. Darren Wood, would you like to take us to a more glamorous spot?
Sure. We do a lot of work performing in small venue museums and outside. And consequently, we end up using porta potties. And with the present situation, are there dangers of porta potty usage? Are they a good option? And do you have any suggestions on the safest and best way to utilize them?
Yeah, Darren, I learned so much when you hosted us in New London, and thank you for that. the porta potties are notorious for running out of hand sanitizer. Most of them are not even, don't even have a hand sanitizer. And when I went jogging and went by the Guilford High School and went into the porta potty and tried to use the hand sanitizer, of course there wasn't any. So that's the big problem, is hand washing is so elusive when one uses a porta potty. That's the number one challenge, I think. You know, if we could have porta potties reliably wiped down, that would be a good thing. If we could have hand washing, that would be a good thing. So insofar as a giant bucket of city water, you know, you'd have a, I don't know, 20-gallon, however big, and you could just have a simple hand washing station outside the porta potty. That would be a good thing. Or you have the hand sanitizer, which is a little easier to manage outside. Or and then you have the ability to just wipe down the porta potty as you used it, and that might just be some you know, little bit of water and paper towels within the porta potty. None of this is easy. None of this is totally reliable, but you're going to have slightly less usage now anyway. People are going to hold on, so to speak, if they can, because they just don't want to use shared spaces. So there may be a little bit less usage, and of course one can do the same thing that I mentioned with the children's changing stations, the baby changing stations. One can have a staff member who is going in and cleaning the porta potty, you know, every 20 minutes, every half hour. If it's only being used in a limited way for a specific event, you could have them come in every 10 minutes. So at the end of the day, trying to keep it clean, trying to keep it safe.
And Crystal, should we talk about the air in and around porta potties? Sure.
We can do. So any type of exhaust that can be introduced, in some cases it's not feasible. You might also want to consider having some time between usage, if there is some sort of ventilation, or having the door open for some periods, if that's possible. Some suggestions.
Great, thank you. Well, let's stay outside a bit. We've talked a lot about the advantages of outdoor venues and how virus disperses differently outdoors and indoors. Let's talk about our audiences. What should we be requiring of our outdoor audiences? Should we be assigning seating areas, and should we require masks?
Great questions. The safest thing to do is always the same 5 mantra items: masks, physical distancing, hygiene, hand and surface hygiene, outdoor venues, and smaller crowds. Now those are the big 5, and they apply in all circumstances. So already when you have an outdoor event, you've got one of the big 5 automatically, and you're a step ahead, because risk outdoors is far less than risk indoors. Can you space people in 6-foot clusters? That adds to the safety. Can you have the hand sanitizers that we've been discussing? That adds to the safety. Can you ask people to use masks unless they're eating? That adds to the safety. Now, you could say, well, are masks really necessary if you're 6-foot distancing and you're outdoors? And the answer is, they're not as necessary, but do they add another barrier, which is a good thing? And the answer is yes, they do add another barrier, which is a good thing. And so it would be reasonable, I think, to ask people to use masks, even in an outdoor setting. And I think people are getting much more used to using masks now. It's people figured out the bandana masks are very comfortable. They've figured out the fabric masks that are good fit are very comfortable. So I feel like it won't be as big an ask as it might have been a couple months ago.
Excellent. I saw Crystal nodding quite a lot there, so I think we're in agreement here. But do you have anything else to add there?
The importance of wearing masks, even outdoors, is a key message here, especially as you start having larger amounts of people. If they are spaced 6 feet apart, that is one recommendation, but further distancing in masks is always recommended.
Excellent. Great. Darren, perhaps you could share a little bit about your idea of multiple stages, and then if you have any question to follow that up, that'd be great.
Sure. So, with using multiple areas outside or large outdoor venues and different things like that, where we do a lot of stuff either on the piers or in arboretums. And with those large open spaces, are there areas that should be reserved for more risk population?
Yeah, that's tricky. We hate to stigmatize people. We hate to demand that people self-identify, why is this 40-year-old sitting there? Well, I didn't know he had liver disease. I mean, why is this 55-year-old sitting there? Well, I didn't know he was battling cancer. You see what I mean? So it's tricky. But if you make available some of the edges of your venue, sort of, they can be the last people to arrive, they can be the first people to leave, and you say, you discreetly assign that to vulnerable individuals, so that you're not making some big announcement at the stage, oh, if you've got some chronic medical condition, you can sit over there. You have to be sensitive to privacy issues. So what I would say is, if through your ticketing procedure or through discrete alerting, we can often pick out the older folks in the crowd and simply saying, for your convenience, we've reserved some of these edge seating if you'd rather sit there rather than sitting in the middle of the group. And they can either use it or not as they see fit. So that would be one way to sort of, in a sensitive and a respectful way, make a seating arrangement available that's a little bit physically distanced and also enables people to arrive a little later and leave a little earlier.
And just on a follow-up with that, similar to what was discussed with the museum, would it be important to structure an outside venue where there's one designated entrance and one designated exit in terms of establishing a flow for entrance and exit of audience?
I think if you have an event like an outdoor art event where you've got people coming in over a 4-hour period of time, to have one directionality makes a lot of sense. But if you've got a concert, you kind of want to use all your entrances because that reduces density, and then all of your exits, which also reduces density. So I think it depends upon the type of event. I think that the arts festival type event, having single directionality, to me, would make a lot of sense, whereas it wouldn't make as much sense for, say, a concert.
And Frank, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, and thank you both. I mean, all this information, we are learning a great deal, which is wonderful. But that's not to say that the consumer is going to be as well versed as we are. Crystal, you had mentioned, outdoors and wind, etc. To a patron who might be sitting there, and it's a windy day, and they're sitting next to 6 feet away, but they're sitting next to someone who's coughing from them downwind. Is that an area of concern? Do we need to kind of educate people that it's safe to be outside, the wind is not helping to disperse this, or is the wind to our advantage or disadvantage for those patrons? Does that question make sense?
But I'd love for there to be a straightforward response,
Okay.
but there's always different things to consider about it. So yes, if the wind is blowing, then it's going to disperse any type of aerosol that someone might exhale or expel. So yes, that's useful, but it depends on really what is your contact time and what is the concentration. So you're 6 feet away, but are you constantly as someone that is coughing or breathing heavily? That could be an issue. So you want to make sure that the wind is being dispersed in a lot of different directions and not oriented right at the same person continually for the duration of the performance. One thing to consider. And the way that you might want to look at it is if you had someone that was not, say, coughing with some potentially infected viral aerosol, but someone that was smoking, could you smell them at that distance away? Now, smoking is a much more concentrated source of aerosol, but it's the same type of trajectory that it would take. So you want to have that physical distancing and use the wind orientation to guide you if that would be a problem.
So now we have to keep our customers safe and move the natural wind source too.
Well, it's just being aware of it, right? So thinking, do you have a prevalent wind that's constantly blowing that day? Then maybe people downwind, might want to reorient or think about just how your spacing would be configured on that particular day.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. That makes complete sense. Thanks.
Yeah, and clearly masks are encouraged at all times here, so that's good. Let's talk a little bit about tents, Crystal. With an outdoor tent, is it different with like putting the sides on? Does that make it an indoor space now, or is without the walls? Is it better, or do we still, what is a tent doing to us? Should we just enjoy the sun?
So yes, sunshine's always appreciated, especially as we start thinking about, winter months coming. So I never like to be too negative, but also we don't want to be in the sun for continual times, especially for the length of performance in some cases. So a tent is useful, but it can also create a surrogate indoor space and decrease ventilation. So if there is the opportunity to put up a tent, keeping the sides off of it, you're going to have that cross flow, that breeze, but still get the sheltering effect of the tent that you're really looking for to keep out of the sun. Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, let's stay outside a little bit more here and talk about our performers on stage. Is there a safe distance where they can perform without a mask? And does that change if they're a singing performer or a specific instrument?
So 6 feet is recommended. But if someone is singing or playing an instrument, then you have this projectile greater distance that these small aerosols or these like microscopic droplets can travel. So in those cases, then more spacing is recommended. So 10 feet is better than 6 feet, and 12 feet is even better. So something to consider even when you are in outdoor spaces.
Great, excellent, thank you. So Becky, let's go back to our little tour with you visit and talk a little bit about retail space.
Sure. So we've made the decision. We have a pretty small retail area at the Flow Grizz. And so we've determined that it's probably best to only have a few people in there at a time. We were looking at how many people should be a threshold versus a family unit where we understand they've been sheltering in place. And I would like to know a little bit more about if a family unit has more than a predetermined number of people that we would consider our threshold. Is that okay? So Crystal, I don't know if you had thoughts about that in terms of those that we are aware have sheltered in place together versus those that have not done so.
So I think the key issue here is who else is that family unit going to come in contact with? So if it's with, go ahead, you have something to say.
No, that's exactly it. If it's one family unit that has more people, so it would only be that unit versus having different people coming in from that are strangers. So let's say if we only allowed 4 people in and a family unit of 5 people would want to access a gift shop area together, would that be a problem or would that be okay?
Right. So then, I mean, it all comes, yeah, there's a lot of not straight answers here, but it's thinking about then what is the impact of that family unit? Because if you think about them, if one person is affected, the others are also likely to be infected. And now they're breathing. And if someone coughs within that, they're more likely to collectively. So that creates then an increased risk for others within that space.
Okay, let's talk about family units a little bit more. What exactly does this mean? And I think this comes from a question that we received through email just a bit ago about summer camps. Seems one question is, would they have a student? It's a long question, but I'm going to try to paraphrase it. They have a student whose parent works in New York City and comes up back and forth. So the question is it safe to have that camper in with the others, or is this a year that that camper should potentially take a year off?
I will take a stab at that. The nature of camps is very outdoor oriented. Activities tend to be outdoors. Dorms tend to be drafty. You know, eating halls tend to be drafty. All of that's good. Clustering a lot of kids together in a crowded space is not so good. So there is ambivalence that everybody has about summer camps. And I think that the summer camp that I would send my kid to would be one that had built my consumer confidence with a thoughtful plan on how they're going to have their archery separated by 6 feet. They're going to limit the number of people who are in pools. They're going to be emphasizing certain outdoor activities over others, the ones that keep people, you know, physically distanced rather than the ones that cluster people. I would like to see the summer camp with a pretty good plan on how they're going to keep my kids safe and how they're going to keep the staff and other kids safe, and make my judgment based on what I've learned from the plans of that summer camp. If there's a summer camp pretty clueless and, you know, welcome back to summer camp, and well, this is, you know, we're confident that everything's going to be fine with your kid, and sort of magical thinking, I might forego summer camp at that particular place that particular year.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I know that a lot of these questions are tough. We have a lot of really great questions coming in through Q&A, and Sten and Crystal are magically typing answers quickly. I just want to remind you all that our next gathering we'll answer many of these questions that are asked about the specific venue, questions about HVAC and what you need to do with your building. So don't hesitate to bring those great questions. And like I said earlier, please give us more questions throughout the next week or so that we are sure to come to the table with all the right answers, or at least good guidance. We have, I know we kind of got on this subject, but we also have a couple of questions here, again, about audience and performer, distance between the audience and performer. Do you think we should address that one more time? What should we do about that? Sten, you had a great idea in New London that I thought you might want to share when we were looking at a parking lot as a potential space, and how you face the performers potentially different ways.
Well, you know, when we have fans, you like to point the fan towards your face so you're cooled. But for COVID purposes, we often like to point the fan away so it's sucking air away from us. Indoors, we call that negative pressure. And you can get that, let's say you're in a dance studio and you've got a window that you can actually open. Well, buying a box fan and facing the fan outdoors, in other words, suck the air out. Don't push the air towards your face, but suck it out. Crystal tells us that is massive in terms of the air exchange, and you can have a tremendous airflow taking the air coming from us humans and pulling it outside. And so similarly, in outdoor venue, you can have something that's actually pulling air away from the musicians, away from the performers, away from whomever is on stage. And that might be a good idea. Another idea is you have, let's say you've got two singers and they're singing not towards the crowd, but to the side. So they're projecting their voices, and a talented, well-trained singer can project their voice so that you'd rather be 18 feet away, not 6 feet. But if they're projecting it against, nobody, then the amount of aerosol coming from their voices into the crowd is going to be minimized. So there are just some strategic approaches. You can even have actors speaking a little bit away from each other, not towards each other. And I think a creative, sensitized choreographer and or director can actually reduce risk with some strategic decisions that they might not make in an ordinary year, but in a coronavirus year, they're going to adjust their routine.
And Sten, can a face shield help with the desire to be closer to each other, or what do you? Especially again, we're talking about singing and performance.
We're talking in the schools about face shields for language teachers, because if the language teacher just says un peu de plaisir, you can barely understand them, and you don't see their lips. But if they can be seen and they don't have to wear a mask and they say un peu de plaisir, you've got the articulation of the mouth that's actually part of the learning experience. And what we're recommending in those situations is have the language instructor have a face shield and have them be 12 feet away, if at all possible, from the folks. So those are the sorts of things one could think about in the arts as well, that the face shields do block bigger droplets the way a mask does. Not as efficiently as a mask, but pretty well. And the aerosols will get out, but if you're further away, there'll be a dilutional effect. Crystal, would you agree with that?
Yes, so the face shields are great at the larger droplets, but they will do very little for the aerosols. So that physical distancing, that increased distance will be important, and also more ventilation in the spaces where you are relying on those face shields.
Excellent, great. Well, I have no idea how this happened, but 1 hour has passed, and we have once again answered a lot, but there's still so much on the table. To all our attendees, I encourage you to send me as much information as you can in terms of what you need and what we can provide for you. We have set out a plan from now through September of various different ideas on what we will be sharing with you in coming sessions. But again, Eric at shorelinearts.org is a great place to send information, or office@shorelinearts.org, or reach out to any of our task force members. Sten and Crystal, we just can't even begin to let you know how much this means to all of us. It's helping the arts sector in such a huge way, and I, again, on behalf of all of us out here, thank you. You're just helping us with making sure that our risk reduction strategies are good and on target. So I guess unless Sten or Crystal have anything you'd like to wrap up with, we're a little bit past. And anything you'd like to close with, Sten, Crystal?
Well, we haven't answered all the questions. I'm sorry about that. So maybe somebody can. I see several that I haven't gotten to, but unfortunately I have a hard stop 2 minutes ago, so I've got to go.
Yeah.
But we're just happy to be of some use. Keep in mind Yale School of Public Health. We're trying to get our name out there and try to have all of you aware that we're hopefully a great resource for the state of Connecticut. So tell your board members, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the museums and at the events.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you all. Watch YouTube and Facebook at Shoreline Arts Alliance for your quickest information, and we'll be talking to you all soon. Have a great weekend, and thank you all, Task Force. You're wonderful. Take care. Have a great day.